Okay, so good afternoon again, those who have joined recently. In the previous class, we had talked about the various characteristics of a masonry unit. What is a masonry unit? A brick. So what are the different characteristics that a masonry unit needs to have and how to test them, right? So various types of tests we had talked about. We had talked about compressive strength test, water absorption test, then tensile strength or flexural strength test. Then there was warpage test, you remember? So efflorescence test was there, and dimensions and visualization, those kind of tests were there. So likewise, we had done several tests, we had studied about several tests, and then uh, from there we learned how to classify the bricks. So the brick classification was basically this table. Classes are given in this table in IS 1077, different classes. So say, for example, the classes vary from 3.5 to 35 classes. Okay, so 35 corresponds to 35 Newton per millimeter square or 35 MPa. So if the brick has strength more than 35 MPa, then you will call it class 35. 35 MPa is pretty strong uh, brick. Okay, likewise. So if the brick has, if the average strength of all the bricks that you have tested is between 20 and 25, then it comes under class 20. Okay, and there was a solved example also, which I did not solve in the class, but it was given in the presentation. So I hope that you had gone through the example. It was pretty straightforward, but you still need to go through it once to make sure that you are following the steps. Okay, and also there was other requirements. So for example, when you do water absorption test and when you do efflorescence test, in addition to the class that you decide from compressive strength, also there is a requirement that based on the water absorption test, if you want it to be a concrete brick of more than 12.5 class, then water absorption should not be more than this. Likewise, for efflorescence, there was a requirement that if the brick is more than 12.5 class brick, then the efflorescence should not be more than this. So these kind of requirements are there, so that the classification is primarily based on the compressive strength, but it is also slightly, at a few places, it is tied with water absorption and also with efflorescence. Okay, so, and then there was a warping test that I had described. So today we will start with the discussion on mortar, right? So what is mortar? So basically mortar is just the binding material that is placed between the layers of bricks. Okay, so basically if you have seen any brickwork, the brickwork always is done in layers, right? So you do one layer of bricks, then a layer of mortar, then another layer of bricks, and when you put a layer of bricks in between the bricks, right, there are vertical planes, and in those vertical planes also you fill mortar. Okay, so that mortar is typically made of cement, sand, and water. These are the three obvious constituents of mortar. Sometimes cement is substituted or partly substituted or completely substituted with lime. Okay, so that could be another thing. Sometimes some pozzolana or something could be added. We will talk about that briefly here. You will learn more about these things when you take the course on concrete technologies. Okay, so the ratio of cement to sand volume ratio is usually between 1:3 to 1:6. That is what is practiced in real life, in everyday life. So if you ask any mason, those who do this kind of masonry kind of work, they would say yes. If you take 1:3 or 1:4, so that means one part by volume, loose volume, one part cement and 3 parts or 4 parts sand. That is and this sand is not the very fine sand. It is sand of particle size of approximately 1 millimeter or more. Yeah, so between 1 and 3 millimeters, something like that. So that is the particle size for a typical sand that we are talking about. So you mix cement and sand in this proportion, 1:3, 1:4, you are going to get a very strong mortar. If you mix them in 1:5 to 1:6 ratio, then you will get relatively weak mortar. Okay, so, and water cement ratio, then how much water to add? So usually your water cement ratio should be somewhere in between 0.7 to 1.0. Actually, water cement ratio that is calculated by weight is a very critical parameter, and you will hear a few times this phrase water to cement ratio. That is, for one water how much cement, or sorry, for one cement, water cement ratio, right? So for one cement how much water. So in concrete typically we use something around 0.5. So if you take 1 kilogram of cement, then you take half a kilogram of water, and that's how you prepare concrete typically. And the rest of the constituents, the big aggregates, large aggregates, small aggregates, all those things. In mortar, you have to use more water. Can anybody guess why do we have to use so much more water in mortar than in concrete? You followed, right? So you have to use 0.7 to almost 1 kilogram of, or 1 liter of water for 1 kilogram of cement in mortar. But in concrete, I mentioned that the amount of water for same amount of cement is only about half a kg. Anybody wants to guess why? Yeah, very good. So the answer Likhit has given is to make it like a paste-like substance. The idea is that mortar has to have a very high level of workability. Usually you don't put concrete in a layer of 1 centimeter, that is 10 millimeter thick layer. Concrete is usually deposited in larger quantities. So concrete is sometimes required to flow, and that flowability is achieved not by adding water, but for mortar, the strength is not so much of a concern immediately. What is of more importance for us is that mortar spreads. So when we take some amount of mortar and we put it on a brick and then we spread it, right? So then it should be able to maintain that uniform thickness, let's say 10 mm thickness or 12 mm thickness or something throughout, and it should be able to cover and fill all the small undulations on the brick. So for example, brick surface is not perfectly smooth, right? The brick surface is made of small undulations, and mortar should be able to get into those small gaps and fill it so that it develops a bond. So for that, the mortar should be more flowy. It should not be more stiff. So basically, now you can think of mortar as two different stages. The first stage of mortar is when mortar is in plastic form, when it is in liquid form, right? So then at that time it is, why am I calling it plastic? Because it is deformable. I can deform it and then it maintains the shape, retains the shape. So that's very plastic kind of property. So that is the paste kind of property. So at that time, I require the mortar to behave in a particular fashion. But when it hardens, when it solidifies, that is second stage. And in the second stage, I want completely different type of properties from mortar. And that's where the balance has to be struck. Correct? So if you do too much of this one, if you try to make it too plastic, then it may adversely affect some of its properties after it hardens. So what are the properties that we want from mortar when it is plastic form, but it is in paste form? We want it to be workable. What do I mean by workable? It should be able to spread. It should be able to deform and spread the way I want. It should not be too dry, too stiff. For example, if you take a dough of clay, so you make a ball or you make a paste, but not really paste. Dough is the best word. So if you make a dough out of clay, so it is very deformable. You can give it whatever shape you want and it does not break. It does not break apart. But if your sand, let's say in that clay, you add a little bit extra sand, then what happens to that dough? That dough becomes very non-workable. You cannot deform it in the shapes that you want. Similarly for mortar, of course, you can't achieve the workability of the level of clay, but still you want it to have certain amount of workability. If there is not enough water, then you will not have enough workability. So water as well as cement. So if it's too much of sand, then it will not have the workability. So it should be able to fill all the nooks and corners of the brick surfaces. Okay. The other one is rate of hardening. So it should not be too fast. The rate of hardening should not be too fast. Also, it should not be too slow also. Why? First, I'll explain why not too fast. If mortar hardens very, very quickly. So for example, one time at one place, mason is mixing some amount of mortar and then another mason is using it to lay bricks. Now, what may happen is that you cannot mix mortar in very small quantities because that will take too much of effort. You have to mix in certain sizable quantities. So then by the time that the entire mortar gets utilized in the process, the mason who is laying the bricks needs some time to do that, right? So let's say one batch of mortar should not get exhausted in half an hour. So let's say you need at least 2 hours for the mortar to be utilized fully, consumed fully, right? So that means you need a setting time which will be at least 2 hours so that mortar doesn't harden within 2 hours. Because if it hardens, then cannot be disintegrated and hardened again, because once the hydration process has started, then basically you have very little time left. So that as long as it is not hardened, you can mix it again and then use it. So that's why you need a decent amount of window, decent time window, if you may want to say that, in which you can use this mortar without it hardening, and as soon as it starts to harden, it will lose the workability. Then you cannot really lay it nicely. Why should it not harden too late also? Mostly that is not a problem. Most of the cements nowadays that are available, they have this problem of hardening too soon rather than hardening too late. So if it hardens too late, what may happen is that you keep building brick after brick after brick, and in the initial stage when it is wet, at the time it has very low strength. So initially it may be able to take the weight of couple of bricks, but over a period of time, let's say if the mortar doesn't dry after 5 hours also, then it has not gained any strength after 5 hours also. Then what may happen is that within 5 hours, you may stack bricks to such a height that all that weight will make it deform too much, and the mortar will ooze out from the sides under that weight, under that heavy pressure. Okay, so that should also not happen. So there should be a decent rate of hardening. It should not harden too slow, and it should not harden too fast. The other very important property or characteristic of a mortar is that it should be able to retain water. So what retains water? Sand does not retain water, right? Sand is not pervious. It is the cement. It is because cement has this characteristic of binding with water. Okay, so the cement should have the chemical characteristics so that it is able to retain water. If it does not have that, if it repels water, or if it easily gives away water, then what happens is that as soon as you put the mortar on bricks have pores, right? And capillary action takes into play. And as soon as you put mortar on bricks, it will start to absorb the water from the mortar, and as a result, mortar will become dry. So to prevent that, we are required to soak bricks in water for significant amount of time. So the way it is done is that either before you start laying the bricks in a wall, you soak them in water, you dip them in water, you let it be there for half an hour, 1 hour, and then you take it out, so that at least from outside the brick is completely wet. Then you clean the surface dry so that the surface is not wet, because if the surface is wet, that means as you add the mortar, it will add water to mortar, which is a bad thing. If the surface is too dry and there are there are unsaturated pores inside the brick, and then mortar is placed on top of it, then the brick will absorb that water from out of the mortar. That is also bad news. So both of them should be avoided. Okay, so there are two ways you can do it. You can either dip the bricks in a bucket of water or something just before laying them for half an hour or 1 hour or something. Alternatively, what you can do is you have a stack of bricks somewhere. There you spray water for a long time, and sometimes that is done, but sometimes the second approach is also used depending on the quantity of bricks you need to use on that particular day. Yeah? But at the end, the brick should be dry at the surface, but right under the surface, it should be saturated. Okay, so as long as you do that, these things, you take care of these three things. You make sure that there is a water retentivity in this mortar, there is the rate of hardening is appropriate, and so that the mortar remains workable. These three things are taken care of. The mortar is generally considered good as far as first stage is concerned. The second stage, that is hardened stage, then you need three different properties. The first one, the foremost one, is the bonding with the masonry unit, that is brick. So mortar should be able to bond with the bricks. Now it can bond with bricks in two ways. One is that brick surface itself may have some undulations. For example, if you have a granite brick or a stone brick, okay, stone brick is usually very rough. When the stone is cut, it splits into two parts, and the surface that you get is relatively rough. So on that rough surface, the cement water slurry or cement water paste, whatever it is, that will be able to get that thing in contact with small cracks that are there on the surface and grip it. Okay, so that is one way. The other one is that in clay bricks there is undulation on the surface, but also in the clay bricks you have pores. Okay, they go deeper into the brick. And then what happens once the slurry is placed on the brick, those pores will start absorbing all that water cement slurry. And as a result, there will be this kind of a continuation of the slurry from the brick into the mortar. That way, it gains strength. Okay, so that's how you develop bond strength. Now, it can be hurt if you have very high initial rate of absorption. We have discussed this one of this thing, IRA. And if the surface roughness is not there, if the surface is very smooth, again, you have a very poor quality of masonry bond. Another one is curing condition. So basically, curing condition is, basically what is curing? We had talked about this curing when we were talking about compressive strength test of bricks. Curing is the time that you give for cement to harden, or concrete to harden, or mortar to harden. So wherever you have cement requires continuous supply of water, so that because what happens under heat, the water will evaporate, and whatever water you had mixed may not be sufficient because it starts to evaporate soon. And hydration process itself creates heat. So because of that, water can evaporate quickly, and then there may not be sufficient water available for the hydration process to complete. Hydration process is the process through which cement gains its strength. So now that process wherein you add water from outside, so either you, if it's a small component, you can dip it in after casting, you dip it in water. That's what we had done. But initially, if it's a big component or initial few hours after casting, after placing the mortar, you cannot dip it in water, so you spray water, okay, or you cover it with a water bag, jute bag, which is a wet jute bag. So you cover it with the jute bag and then spray water from the top, so that there is enough moisture inside, so that hydration process is not affected. Okay, so these curing conditions have to be taken care of. So every time after laying the bricks for at least 24 hours or 2 days, you have to keep spraying water once in a while. Every few hours, you have to go and spray the water on the wall. The idea is that there should be enough water available for the hydration process to complete. Okay. This last point I have already explained, absorption of cementitious water slurry into brick. Okay. Any questions so far? All right. Moving forward, the other important characteristic of the hardened mortar is compressive strength, and the third one is volume stability. Okay. Compressive strength is not really most significant quality of mortar, and we will see later why. But it still plays a role in governing overall strength of masonry. Basically, what we want out of a masonry is that it should be the assembly of bricks and mortar that can be called masonry assemblage. So this masonry assemblage has overall high strength. So for that, the strength of the assemblage is made of strength of the brick and strength of the mortar, and maybe some other parameters also. So each one of them should be as high as possible. So you can have high strength bricks and you can have high strength mortar. Of course, there will be cost involved, so you have to do a compromise, but it basically will improve the strength of the masonry assemblage. However, we will see later that as you increase the strength of mortar, the strength of the assembly does not necessarily increase very significantly. It may increase a little, but not very significantly. Okay, so the first property was bonding with the mortar, bonding with the brick. So mortar should be able to bond with the brick. That is very, very critical. That is important so that the brick can maintain its stability. If there is not good enough bond between mortar and brick, under lateral loads, the brick can fall. Okay, so that is the biggest risk for the brick walls, and that's why bond is the most important, most critical parameter for the mortar. The second one is compressive strength, and the third one is volume stability. Volume stability is kind of a bit complicated phenomenon. It basically means that the mortar should not deform too much. Okay, volume stability basically means its volume should not change. That means it should not deform. Basically, that's what it means. Now, there can be various reasons why it may deform. One is mortar is there. Mortar is, even though it may not feel like, after it hardens, it's a very elastic material. It will not deform a lot, but if you apply some stress, it will deform a little. Okay, so it's an elastic material. So under load, it will deform elastically. That is one type of deformation, but we are not really too much worried about this elastic deformation right now. Another one is creep. So wherever you have cement type of material, there is a likelihood of creep deformation. What is creep? I would recommend all of you to, whichever phrases you are not able to understand, you please go to the internet and search for them. And these things are not very complicated. You should be able to get the meaning of these things. So creep deformation, it is like what happens. Let's say I take a block of mortar, a square cube of mortar, okay, and this mortar cube, I apply some load on it, okay. So elastic deformation means if the load was 0, deformation was 0. When the load increased to 10, deformation also increased to 10, okay. Let's say there is a 1-to-1 correlation between force and deformation. So you increase the force to 10, deformation also became 10. Okay. Now you maintain that 10 force to 10, and the deformation will maintain at 10 forever. As soon as you, after 2 years, you come back, you remove the load from 10 to 5, the deformation becomes 5. That is elastic deformation, elastic behavior. The second one is creep, that is mentioned here, elastic creep in drying shrinkage. The creep behavior is basically time dependent deformation. So what happens is that I take a cube, I apply a load of 5 kilonewton, it deforms to 5 kilonewton. I apply a load to 10 kilonewton, it deforms to 10 kilonewton. That is elastic behavior so far. Then I leave 10 kilonewton acting on the brick or on that cube for a very long time. And I come back again 1 year later, and what I see is that instead of 10 deformation, now the deformation has become 11. Slightly, it has increased slightly. That is called creep deformation. Creep is basically under stress. There is a time dependent deformation. So if you apply any stress, with time, things deform. Okay, even though the force did not change, the stress did not change, things still deform with time. So that kind of a deformation is called creep deformation. The third one, that is the most important one, that is of importance here, is drying shrinkage. So again, whenever cement is involved, this hydration process that I have just talked about, what happens in the hydration process is that before the hydration process starts, there are water bubbles. There are tiny droplets of water in the mixture. Okay. When the hydration starts, then this water is consumed chemically by cement in the hydration process. And as a result, those voids are those tiny water particles, whatever you want to call them. Those things turn into voids, and those voids start to shrink, right? You can expect them to shrink, right? So as they shrink, those voids, when the water is consumed, then the entire structure starts to shrink. And as a result, as the water gets consumed more and more, as the hydration process goes on and concrete dries, then this shrinkage takes place, which is called drying shrinkage. Okay. So drying shrinkage is another major problem with mortar because there is cement involved here. So basically what happens is that if you take a chunk of mortar and you let it hydration process, let the hydration process complete. After the drying shrinkage deformation, you will have a slightly reduced size. But let's say I take a very, very big piece of mortar layer. Let's say imagine the layer of mortar placed on a 5-meter long wall. Okay, so that's a continuous layer of mortar over a 5-meter long wall. Now that layer of mortar, if it starts to shrink, it cannot shrink all the way from 5 meter away. So what will happen as a consequence? Anybody? So a 5-meter long layer of mortar wants to shrink because of this drying shrinkage phenomenon. But you can understand, right? So there may not be enough capacity available, tensile strength available to pull all that 5-meter long mortar layer. So what will happen to mortar in that case if it cannot pull all that layer, but it wants to shrink? Anybody? I'm waiting for a reply. No? No answers, no? At least guess. Get cracks. Very good. Yeah, that was an obvious answer. Very nice. Yeah, so basically that layer, if it cannot shrink, then it will crack everywhere. And that is the bad news. So therefore, we should try to minimize the amount of drying shrinkage, because as the water gets consumed, or evaporated. Anything can happen. It can get evaporated, it can get consumed in the chemical reaction. Either way, as that happens, the concrete starts to dry, sorry, mortar starts to dry, and as a result, there is a shrinkage. And we can prevent that shrinkage by going for an appropriate type of water cement ratio. So if you have high water cement ratio, that is high amount of water, then there is a high amount of drying shrinkage, and therefore large amount of cracks. So you have to keep the water content low, because so that you don't have too much cracking. Okay. So in this case here, the tables turn, and in fact that water that can be absorbed sometimes by masonry may actually reduce the water content, and then may actually reduce the chances of drying shrinkage. Okay, so now coming to the classification of mortar. So as per the Indian code IS 1905, this is the Indian code, you can see the name here. There are broadly three classes of mortar. One is H, that is high strength mortar. Other one is M, that is medium, and L is low. Okay. Within H, there is H1 and H2. There is M1, M2, M3 within medium, and L1 and L2 within low grade mortar. Okay. Now, in this table, basically it gives you for a particular grade of mortar what kind of strength is expected, and that strength is measured after 28 days. Okay, because it is you may remember that mortar gains strength due to hydration of cement, and hydration of cement is a time-consuming process. So after you mix cement and water for a couple of hours, it does not even harden. After maybe 4 hours, 5 hours, it becomes hard. It maintains its shape, but still it is very, very weak. After 24 hours, it is still very weak. 7 days, maybe it attains approximately 60 to 70% of its full strength. 28 days is generally a standard duration after which we test cement-based materials. Okay, so if you test the the strength of this mortar, and there is a procedure for testing the strength of the mortar, it is not very different from any other concrete testing or something. So I'm not going to get into the process of testing compressive strength, but basically what it says is that the compressive strength of that mortar for H1 class should be at least 10 MPa, right? And for H2, it should be at least 7.5 and 6, depending on which class. Within H2, there are two classes, so it could be somewhere in between. Okay, likewise for each class, each grade. And the rows in between, the columns 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, they give us the details of how to prepare that kind of a mix, H1 mix, H2 mix, and so on. So what it says is, for example, if you look at H1 mix, it says take 1 part cement by volume, loose volume, and take some part of cement, lime, but this lime is not a mandatory requirement. You may or may not take lime. Actually, what it says is that lime helps improve the workability, but it is not really taken often. Some pozzolana, don't have to worry about pozzolana by now. And then take 3-part sand. So take 1 part cement, 3 parts sand by volume, and then you are likely to achieve at least a 10 MPa strength in that mortar. You remember what was the mix we had used for the compression test? You remember we had filled the frog of the brick before the compression test, and that mortar had a particular mix ratio. Does anybody remember what that ratio was? 1:1, correct. So that was very, very strong mortar ratio. 1:3 is the highest class mortar that you can achieve, and the strength is approximately 10 Newton per millimeter square. Now, also you must remember what are the classes for bricks. Up to what grade do the bricks go? Brick classes go. You remember the classes of bricks that we had discussed? Starting from the smallest value to the largest value. What was the smallest grade brick? What was the largest grade brick? What was the smallest grade brick? 3.5. I'll go back. So its smallest class was 3.5 and largest was 35. Okay, so now remember this 3.5 and 35. Now what it is saying for mortar is the highest class mortar is required 10 MPa in comparison to 35 MPa. That was the highest for brick. So of course, mortar is expected to be weaker than bricks. Okay, and it may have as low as 0.5, very, very low in comparison to the bricks. In fact, almost 7 times weaker than the lowest quality bricks. All right, so mortar is expected to be weaker than bricks, but still this mortar can be used with any kind of a brick. Okay. So basically from this table, let's say you are making a building and you want to specify, so you will specify, go for an H1 or H2 type of mortar and this class brick, and that's how you build a wall. So now we have learned a little bit about how the bricks behave, what are the characteristics of bricks, and we have learned a little bit about what are the characteristics of mortar. Now we will get into the assemblage, right? So when we make the assembly of bricks and mortar, then what do we expect out of it? So there are two subtopics of this topic. One is in what ways you can assemble them. The second one is if you want to study the properties, then there is a standard way of assembling them, and how do the properties of this assembly change as we change the properties of bricks and the mortar. Okay, so first one, we are going to talk about in which ways the bricks can be configured in a wall. Okay, so these are the 4 different ways. One is called stretcher bond, another one is called header bond, the third one is English bond, and the fourth one is Dutch bond. Basically, these are the configurations in which you can place bricks in a wall, so that these are the common ways in which it is done. Okay, these are traditionally developed methods. So stretcher and header bond are pretty simple. This is the stretcher bond. So let's say you have a brick of height is a separate parameter. Ignore the height of the brick. So you have length and width of a brick, and typically the width is half or approximately half of the length. Yeah, so that is generally the ratio that is maintained. So width is usually half of the length, and height is independent anyway. Height can be anything. Sometimes you have very thick, very high bricks, and sometimes we may have very shallow bricks. Okay, so in case of a stretcher bond, what you are seeing here is what you can see here is like this is how, if you look from the top, this is the length of the brick and this is the width of the brick. Okay, so typically width is approximately half of the length. That's why we can say that the wall that you make with the stretcher bond, if you make a wall with the stretcher bond, then your thickness of the wall is only half the brick. So it's called 1/2 brick thick wall. So the wall is only 1/2 brick thick. And since the wall is very thin, stability of these kind of walls is questionable. Okay, so they are not very stable. So therefore, you would hardly ever see such kind of walls being used under load-bearing conditions. So if the wall is supposed to support any slab or anything of that kind, then you never use. Or if it is a boundary wall, there is a big chance of lateral movement of the wall. In such cases, you would never use this kind of a half a brick thick wall. Okay, this kind of walls can be used for internal partitions. Correct. So if you have an apartment and you want to erect a wall, but it is not supposed to, the wall is not going to support the slab. Slab is already there, which is supported on the beams, and you just want to fill that gap. So then you can go for this half brick thick wall. Okay. What is happening here is, so in one layer, so here you can see in the elevation that when you look at the wall from front, you can see that these are all, this is the length of each brick, right? So only the length and the height, this face is visible. Length, height, face is visible. No other face is visible, and the wall looks exactly the same from the other side. Okay, this is the plan view of one layer. In the next layer, what will happen in the next layer? In the next layer, the bricks will be offset. So the next layer will be formed. The next layer will be formed like this. Okay, so there will be an offset created in the next layer, and likewise you can make it. So that's a very simple pattern. There is not much complication in this pattern. This is called a stretcher bond. Why is it being called a stretcher bond? Because you are using longer dimension of the brick in the longitudinal direction of the wall. That means you're trying to stretch as much distance as possible, cover as much distance as possible. That's why it's called a stretcher bond. The other one is a header bond. So header bond is identical as the stretcher bond, except that in this case, instead of using the length of the brick in the longitudinal direction, so this is the longitudinal direction of the wall, and this is the length of the brick. So instead of using length of the brick in the longitudinal wall, you use width of the brick. So you width of the brick is parallel to the longitudinal wall. This is called header bond. Okay, again, from both sides, from the front as well as from the back, the pattern looks very similar. You can see this kind of staggered pattern. So there is one brick here, then the next brick is staggered on both sides, then again that brick is there. So it is that kind of a checkered staggered pattern. Okay, this is header bond. Any questions between up to now? Header bond or stretcher bond or anything? So both these bonds are clear to you, right? Okay, moving forward then. The third one, that is the most popular kind. None of the earlier ones are really popular. If you want to make a half a brick wall, then there is no other option but to go with the stretcher bond, and sometimes that is done for internal walls. But the header bond is not really very popular. If you are willing to go for one brick thick wall, then it is the English bond. That is the most common type of bond, and you will see this kind of a wall pattern. If you look at this wall pattern from the front, this is a very common type of a wall pattern that you will see everywhere. Yeah, especially with the clay brick. This is the very common type of a wall pattern that you see. So what do you have? If you don't notice carefully, you have one layer where the length of the brick is in the longitudinal direction. In the other layer, the width of the brick is in the longitudinal direction, and alternatively they are placed. Okay, now obviously what it means is that when the width of the brick is in the longitudinal direction, when the width is in the longitudinal direction, the length is in the perpendicular direction, that is normal to the wall, plane of the wall. Okay, so that means the brick will be at least one brick thick wall. So that is what is mandatory. So the thickness of the brick will be equal to the length of one brick. So one layer will be placed like this. The other layer, the second layer, will be placed by putting two bricks in this configuration. Okay, so it is made of alternate such layers. In one layer, you put bricks longitudinally, but then you put two bricks side by side, like here and here. And then in the subsequent layer, you put bricks not longitudinally, but laterally, but next to each other, just like that, like here. Now, there is a problem here. We have to create a stagger between the two. Why do we have to create a stagger? We don't want a continuous joint between the layers. You understand? So if we had done this, let's say, if we had one layer like this, and then we had put another set of bricks like this. So one layer is half brick, another layer is full brick on length side, and another layer is width side. So this is width size, this one is width size, this is length side. If we had done this kind of an arrangement, what would happen is that you have a continuous joint throughout the height of the brick, height of the wall, right? Which is not desirable. So all these bonds, the way they are developed in such a way so that you can stagger the joint. The joint should not be a straight line. So how do we do that? What we do is we introduce these are called queen closure. So these kind of arrangements wherein we put a thinner brick. So basically either you buy a thin brick or you cut a brick into thinner part and you place it there, so that subsequently there will be an offset. Then we create an offset so that the joints are in the middle of the brick rather than right under the joint. The joint should not come under the joint. Okay. So basically in this brick system, you have one layer of header and one layer of stretcher. So this is the header layer and this is the stretcher layer. So stretcher, header following each other. That is the arrangement in the English bond. The fourth one and the last one is the Dutch bond or Flemish bond. This one is also, this one is kind of more complex in comparison to all three. In this one, we have a combination of header and stretcher bonds, but in the previous case, in the English bond, we had one layer of stretcher and one layer of header. One layer of stretcher, one layer of header. In this case, we have, in the same layer, we have both stretcher as well as header. So for example, this is the cross-section plan view of one layer and this is the subsequent layer. So I'm showing you two different layers. So this is one layer, this is the second layer. You can imagine that this layer is basically looking from the front. I'm looking from the front. So it is made of, let's say this is my first layer, then this is my second layer. Okay. So if you look at it from the front, the first layer and the second layer look very similar, except that there is an offset. You agree? So in the second layer, an offset is important because the joints should not follow the joints. The joints in one layer should not come directly under or above the joint in the subsequent layer. So that offset is required. So from the front, they look very similar other than that, but from inside, if you see, there is a big difference. In this layer, for example, in the first layer, in this layer, all these bricks are in header configuration, and all these bricks, this brick is in stretcher, this is in stretcher, but there is some piece of brick that is placed, that is just one half of a brick that is placed there. Okay. Whereas in this particular case, if you see, this layer is stretcher, this layer is also stretcher, this is header, this is stretcher, this is header, this is stretcher. So basically stretcher and header configurations are mixed within each layer, and that's why this is a bit more complex and requires extra skill. This brick wall is 1.5 brick thick. You have got one full thickness here. This is the thickness same as English bond, but then you have got another half a brick thick, right? So that's why this is called a 1.5 thick brick thick wall. It's known as Dutch bond. Any questions about this one? If you need me to explain something again, I can go back and explain. Let me know. No? All good? All right. Moving forward. So now we were on the section that we were discussing was the behavior of assembly. So first part we discussed in which ways you can arrange masonry. So there were four ways: stretcher bond, header bond, English bond, and the fourth one was Dutch bond or Fleming bond. What is the name? Flemish bond. Okay. Now coming to the behavior of masonry assembly. So now we want to know, because we are not interested in knowing how strong the brick is or how strong the mortar is. What we are really interested in knowing is how strong my masonry assembly is. And my masonry assembly, which is basically a combination of brick and mortar, it should behave well in compression. It should be able to carry sufficient amount of compressive load, whatever my requirement is for that. And also it should be sometimes be required to carry some lateral load. So that means you have a wall, let's say this is stretching this way, a wall, and you apply lateral load, or maybe the foundation rotates like this. So then if there is a problem with the foundation, the wall would rotate slightly, and that kind of a rotation the wall will be able to sustain. We would want the wall not to collapse for small rotations or certain amount of rotation. So for such kind of things, there are certain properties that are desirable. Compressive strength is desirable if you have a load on the wall. So if the wall is carrying the weight of the slab, then the wall should be able to resist that load. Okay? So it should have strong enough compressive strength, large enough compressive strength. So the compressive strength of the wall or of the assembly, it depends on a couple of parameters. So the way they test it is that they take 3 bricks, one brick, another brick, 3rd brick, and in between they put a layer of mortar as you wish to. So you can design the layer of mortar you want. So this is the layer of mortar you put in between the bricks, and that is an assembly of bricks. This is a 3 brick assembly. Okay, then they do the curing and everything so that it gains its strength. Then they put this thing again, similar to the brick test, they put this whole assembly under a compressive test machine. Okay, so it is subjected to compressive stress until it fails. Once it fails, then you measure that stress at which it had failed. So what they have observed is this kind of an assembly is significantly, the strength, compressive strength is significantly affected by joint thickness. That is found to be one of the most critical parameters. Also, this assembly strength is usually in between the strength of the individual masonry unit and the mortar strength. So you remember, generally the masonry is stronger and mortar is weaker. And experimentally, they have found that the strength of this assembly is usually in between the two. That should raise some questions. Does anybody find that worrisome that the strength of this assembly is not same as mortar strength? It is somewhere in between the mortar strength and the brick strength. Does anybody find that non-intuitive, difficult to understand? Anybody? What is going on? Somebody should reply now. Okay. Let me rephrase the question. My intuition would have said that the strength of this masonry assembly should be equal to the lesser of the two strengths. So I have one strength, which is strength of the brick, the other one is strength of the mortar, and typically mortar is weaker than the brick. So my intuition would say that strength of the assembly should be same as the strength of the mortar. Shouldn't be. The strength would fail first. Sorry, the mortar would fail first. So as soon as the stress reaches that level, the mortar would fail first, and therefore, why do you need? Should not be able to use more than that strength. So the assembly strength should be same as the mortar strength, but that is not the case. And therein comes in picture the thickness of the mortar, because when you do the mortar compressive strength test, you don't use such a small thickness and you don't put it between the bricks. So in real test, you take a cube of mortar and you test it under compression, and that's how you get the strength of mortar. But strength of that brick of mortar or that cube of mortar versus the strength of this thin layer of mortar, there is a big difference between the two strengths. Okay. And therefore, what you actually see is, because of this confinement between the bricks, the mortar layer actually gains strength. And that strength is basically still governing the strength of the assembly, but that is much higher than the original strength of mortar that you have tested in the lab conditions. Okay, so this is some summary from the various types of experiments that have been conducted on the strength of the assembly, compressive strength of the assembly. And this is strength of the assembly with respect to brick strength. And what a lot of data is plotted here. And if you draw a trend line, this is how the trend line looks like, this curve that you can see here. That is that curve that shows how the strength of the assembly is increasing as we increase the brick strength. So the brick strength is varying somewhere from somewhere such as 6 to almost 18. So this is the range of the masonry strength. And the strength of the prism, the assembly, is varying somewhere from less than 2 to almost 6. So what you can see very clearly is that prism strength, that is assembly strength, is always less than the strength of the brick. That is clear. Another one is that if you take the slope of this line, that will give you an indication of how much contribution bricks make towards the strength of the masonry. So if you take these values here, what you can notice is if I take this slope in this particular region, if I make a 35% change in the brick strength, my masonry strength changes by about 30%. So there is a good correlation between brick strength and masonry strength. Okay. In this set of experiments, these are 4 experiments that somebody had done. What they did was they kept everything else the same. They only changed the strength of mortar. So the bricks are the same, the thickness of the mortar is same. Only thing that changed between these 4 experiments was the strength of mortar. And here what you see is that for a very large change, even in the mortar strength, you don't get very significant change in the prism, in the assembly strength. For a 300% change in mortar strength, you get like 75% change in the prism strength, which is not very, which is very, very relatively low return, right? So that's why we can conclude that mortar strength does not really significantly affect the assembly strength. This is another set of tests where they again tested some number of specimens, but in these 2 cases, here what you see is this black dots are basically corresponding to perforated bricks, and these white squares are corresponding to solid bricks. Let's focus on one of them. Let's say solid bricks or maybe perforated bricks. So in each case, what we see is that as the joint thickness is increasing, so joint thickness, they varied between almost 0 millimeter, 0 inches, all the way to 1 inch almost. The joint thickness went all the way up to 25 millimeter, from almost 0 millimeter to 25 millimeter. And as a result, they measured how the strength of the masonry assembly changed. And what they found was that as the thickness of the joint, thickness of the mortar layer was increased, the strength degraded. Correct? That's why you have downward going plots. Correct? So that obviously means that the strength went down as the thickness of the mortar layer was increased. So what does that mean? It means that we should try to, as long as we can manage, because there are other requirements of the mortar layer other than bonding. Other requirements are to cover that undulations of the brick also. So as long as we can manage, we should try to go for the thinnest possible layer, because that gives us higher strength. Okay. What else is expected out of masonry assembly? In addition to compressive strength, the masonry assembly should also be able to resist out of plane bending. That is, if you have a wall and there is some lateral load acting, and that lateral load could be coming from anywhere. So it could be coming from wind, it could be coming from an earthquake load, it could be coming because the foundation itself is getting a little bit unstable, or it could be coming because of the earth fill. So you may have a wall, let's say you have a wall like this, and there is a foundation under it, and you have earth fill up to this level. Okay, so it is filled with ground up to this level, and here the other person, let's say, has not filled the earth to this level, but has filled only to this level. So then what is happening here is that there is a lateral pressure acting on the wall from this side, and that lateral pressure will also lead to some kind of instability of this wall. So this will push the wall to one side. These kind of things may happen. So these kind of things happen quite often in boundary walls. Okay. So in order to have a good performance in out of plane bending, you need to have good bond strength between mortar and masonry. Okay, and the wall should be heavy. If the wall is heavy, then on its own weight it will not fall. On its own weight it will try to settle all these problems. So if you have a heavy wind load, which wall will be better placed? A thick, heavy wall will be better. So if you have a thick wall, a heavy wall, that is safer. However, that may not always be possible, right? That is expensive if you want to make a wall thicker. So what is the even better option? If you can have a bond which is stronger, so that it does not do, if the bond is not stronger, it will develop cracks here, and the brick and the wall will fall to this side. However, if this bond is strong, it will not crack and it will not let the wall fall down. Okay, so how to develop a good bond, we have already discussed several times. We can't have too much of absorption. We should not have very high initial rate of absorption, but we should have some absorption. So too little absorption is bad. Too high absorption, water absorption, is also bad from the mortar to bricks. Also, workability is important, and strength is also important to some extent. Okay, so with these various parameters, the masonry assembly plays a role. Now coming to the last section of this course, this is the design of brick walls. So I'll just briefly introduce you to different types of brick walls, and these are the two types that we will talk about in this section. The rest of it I'm just introducing you. We will not discuss much about the design provisions of these types of walls. So one type of wall is basically solid wall. So a solid wall is basically a uniform thickness wall. So all these walls that we have discussed before, all these walls can be called solid walls. Okay, this wall or this wall, and so on. So all these are solid walls. So these are types of walls can be called solid walls. Then the other could be solid wall with pilasters. This one. What is a solid wall with pilaster? It is basically a solid wall, but in between, let's say I have a straight wall. That is, I'm looking at the wall from the top. What we may have is in between, we may increase the thickness of the wall. So this is the plan view, and I'm looking from the top. So sometimes what I may do is I may increase the thickness of this wall. Okay, so these are called pilasters. These are extending all the way and down. Yeah. So what is the purpose of these pilasters? They provide lateral stability to the wall. Otherwise, wall may be susceptible to lateral collapse, lateral overturning. But this may overturn this way or this way. But with the help of these pilasters, these are called pilasters, not plasters, pilasters or piers, we can call them. With the help of these pilasters, you can keep the wall stable. Then there are three other types of walls that I mentioned here. One is cavity wall. So in the cavity wall, basically what you have is two solid walls. You may have two solid independent walls, but there is a small gap left in between. So the two walls are serving the purpose of a single wall, but these are made of two independent walls. And you leave some gap in between. Sometimes you can leave that gap open without filling anything. Sometimes you can fill it with some kind of a material. So depending on what is the purpose of this compartment that you are making, you can fill it with different types of materials. You may fill it with water resistant material so that water doesn't leak. You may fill it with soundproof material. You can fill it with heat proof material, or a combination of these. So various types of fillers are available. So whether you are using a filler or not, if there is a gap between the two solid walls, that is known as cavity wall. Another type of cavity wall is veneered wall. So in case of a veneered wall, you have a one solid wall, but then there is a veneer. It's not really this one. The red brick wall in this particular case is not really a wall. It's not really a solid wall. It is only a facade. It's only for the looks. It is not carrying any load. It is only resting. So it is connected with the solid wall through these connectors, because it on its own it does not have much of stability. So these connectors that you have seen, these will be used to connect the veneer with the main solid wall. And again, you will have some cavity in between, and that cavity may be filled. So cavity and veneered walls are very similar, except that in cavity wall, both walls are solid. And in case of a veneered wall, one wall is solid, the other one is only a facade. Then you have a faced wall. In case of a faced wall, you have a single wall which is solid, but you use two different materials, or you use two different configurations. So one side you want to make it look better, so you use different material, but they are all bonded together like so, like in this particular case. Okay. So on one side they have used concrete, the other side they have used clay bricks in such a way so that this is the outside surface, so it looks nice from the outside, but from inside you can just plaster it. You don't have to worry about it. So these are the different types of walls. In the next class, we will discuss about how to design solid walls or solid walls with piers. Okay. Does anybody have any question? Please, somebody ask. At least one question. Seems like nobody has any questions. I'm not that good instructor, huh? Am I? That you don't have any questions at all. Okay. All right. So if you don't have any questions, I will stop this presentation here today.